Um, yeah. So I'll say a few things. I guess you have seen the post, you have read a few things on her bio and also on the abstract. I'm just gonna stick to the basics and say that Ellie is a researcher and teacher doing her PhD in philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. She specializes in Japanese metaphysics, death ethics, and the spatial temporality of identity. So this is gonna be tough for everyone. Um, so I guess the stage is yours, Ellie. You can, obviously, feel free to ramble, and we are here for you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that introduction. So yeah, I am Ellie Palmer, and today we're not going to be talking so much about architecture because that's not what I do. I do philosophy, but obviously all of the things that we're going to talk about today are clearly quite applicable to architectural theory. This is just kind of the more like theory-based, philosophy-based side of the theme for this year's event. And as you can see from the title, oh, I need to share my slides, don't I? 1 second. Okay. And now you'll be able to see the title. Hopefully you've also read the abstract. But yeah, today basically we are just going to be reflecting on space, environment, and identity in Japanese philosophy and architecture. So you can kind of think of today's talk a bit like Japanese Spatiality 101. So what I mean by that is we're basically just going to be doing an introductory kind of course. We're going to be going through a lot of the basics today. And we're going for kind of breadth, not depth. So you'll come away with hopefully a very basic level of understanding of a lot of different concepts that can ultimately be developed more in actual workshops in the event in March. And the aim of today basically is just to introduce the ways in which space, climate, and culture influence our ethics, our relationships with other people and with the world, and then ultimately our identity. So that ties in with the theme. And I'm going to be doing this by introducing you to some central concepts from Japanese philosophy that I work on, such as the role of negative space and of betweenness. So this is the structure of the presentation. We're going to be looking at 3 kinds of spatiality today in Japanese thought. And then we're going to be focusing in on emptiness before going in to discuss one philosopher in particular, whose name is Watsuji Tetsuro, and that's basically who I kind of work on most of the time. And we're going to be talking about his philosophy of betweenness, climate, identity, and lived space. Slide. So this is just a quote from a very famous philosopher of Japanese thought. And this is just kind of to preface the ideas that I'm going to talk about today, because as you'll be seeing, a lot of the concepts of space that we're going to be looking at, they're often not thought of as just physical space. So they're pretty much always intrinsically tied to a feeling, an experience, or a certain kind of social interaction or way of being. So, particularly in Japanese philosophy, but also in Japanese language, arts, and daily life, you'll see that these notions of space are inherently tied to human being. So, our experiences as humans in the world, what it means to be human, and it dictates our relationships with other people and with our environments. And therefore, my argument is it forms a huge part of our identities. So the Japanese language itself actually has multiple different nuanced words for space, and these all represent slightly different aspects of spatial relationships generally. And today we're going to be talking about 3, as I mentioned before, but these are the 3. So we have ba, wa, and ma, and there's some kind of definitions or attempts to translate them. The first one then that we're going to be diving into today is ba. So I like to think of bar as the bonding space. That's kind of my translation. And that's because it can be thought of as the sort of shared space which creates the foundation for the exchange of tacit or experiential knowledge. So that's knowledge in the form of collective emotions, feelings, and experiences. So generally things that can't be expressed in language. And just to compare this, in the West in general, the form of knowledge that's generally emphasized is explicit knowledge. So that's things that are expressible in words, numbers, data, etc. But for many Japanese people, not just philosophers, just general Japanese people, their view of knowledge is as being primarily tacit, so in this form of experiential knowledge. And these are things that are not easily visible or kind of expressible, but they tend to be highly personal, so deeply rooted in a person's actions, experiences, values, and emotions. And that's the kind of knowledge then that's able to be shared in a bar space. So it's a kind that's more difficult to communicate, but vital for building these relationships with others. So the importance of curating this kind of an environment from an architectural point of view is obviously huge for society. In other sources, bar is generally translated, for example, in dictionaries, simply as place, but most of these concepts I'm talking to you today about, they don't necessarily have such neat equivalents in English or maybe in some of the other languages that you speak. So it's hard, if not impossible, to capture all of the nuances in a neat translation like this. But in architectural theory, people tend to kind of say that a place is kind of like a space with history. So place is understood as something beyond just physical space, but it's something that has kind of an emergent identity of its own, and that's formed by the conceptual, individual, and collective memories and associations that it has. So as opposed to that, we need to think about what about the present. So this is kind of the alternative. So bar is a place that instead it connotes a dynamic and presently inhabited space. So it's a place for doing something in the present time. So it's somewhere to hold a communal event or work on a project together like this. And it's characteristically a collaborative place. So it's a place that emerges in the present moment as well. So many Japanese architectural spaces are therefore designed to evolve over time through human interactions rather than just being this kind of static space or prioritizing the preservation of its past or of its original state instead of what works best for present and future populations. The next bullet point, I've just written, bar is not just a spot, but a moment in which one might live a transformative process with others. So what I mean by that is it's not just this space that exists independently of human behavior, but it's one that specifically emerges in the present moment and results in this transformation of the individual through the exchange of tacit knowledge. And then the quote I've just included on the end, I really like this quote, so I'll read you the full bit. It says, bar is the world where the individual realizes herself as part of the environment on which her life depends. So a person can't be in this space as an individual detached from relations with others, but it's about learning from the experiences of others and in turn building these relations with others in these spaces, developing a better understanding of yourself as well as the world. So those who know my lecturing style, obviously none of you have seen any of my talks before, but I kind of have this reputation for talking a lot about the origins of words. I used to work on the philosophy of language, but now this is more just like something I'm passionate about. And it maybe seems a little bit random in this context, but I think especially when dealing with terminology that's not in your native language, it really, really helps to understand its context and history and associations and so on. So the kanji, that's the Japanese like symbol here that you can see next to it. It's actually an ideogram, and the left part of it, I've just drawn an arrow from, originally is a pictograph. So it comes from a picture originally, and that's how their writing system evolved differently from like the alphabets that we use. And that part, so the left part, symbolizes ground. So the meaning of that part on its own is also a word that means ground, and it also means thing that is rising. And you can still kind of see the resemblance. I've put a little picture at the bottom. So this bottom line of the character is supposed to be soil or the ground, and then the kind of T shape that's emerging from it is a plant. So it's a thing that is rising from the ground. And then the right part isn't pictographic, it's just the word that means to enable. So if we look to the actual written word itself, it symbolizes something like a place that enables growth. So that's the extent to which these notions of space are ingrained in everyday life in Japan. So even in the words itself that people use every day, these ideas are reflected. It's just a little fun fact. So in terms of creating physical spaces with good bar, we might call it, it involves the physical arrangement of elements in the space to create connections that are more likely to produce new knowledge or experiences. But it's important to note that this also involves a psychological component. So in terms of like mental bar, we might call it, we need to ensure that the space that we've created not only physically enables these interactions, so I mean like not just things like giving the space appropriate physical properties, like having rooms that are a good size or layout to physically accommodate people that will be engaging in these activities, but it's also about creating the right mental atmosphere for these productive and collaborative relationships to emerge. So these non-physical aspects of space can be encouraged through decisions about certain physical design elements as well. So it's about building spaces that allow socialization, collaboration, exchanging of experiential knowledge that results in the emergence of a larger self. So that's the quote that's used in philosophy. And this means the self that's able to empathize with colleagues instead of just sympathizing with them. So this is just the final note I'm going to mention on BART, and then we'll move on to the next kind of space. But I just kind of have a little facts box in the upper corner. And this is kind of tangentially related to what we're talking about, so that's why it's to one side. But this notion of bar forms a significant part of the foundation of the philosophy of Nishide Kitaro, who we had a quote from him earlier as well. He's one of the most famous contemporary Japanese philosophers. So if you are interested in learning more about Japanese philosophy, I just wanted to drop that little fact in quickly. The next kind of space we're looking at is wa, and wa is generally used to refer to relational space, and it's sometimes translated as harmony, so often specifically social or interpersonal harmony, but it's also describing just this kind of awareness of interpersonal connection, so the awareness of your place in a wider world when you're in spaces. And it's often described in terms of moving air. So because of that, I think it's almost similar to how younger generations like us use the term vibes. So it's kind of like the vibes or the air of a room, or of an event or of a situation in general. So if the room is like calm and balanced and in harmony, we might describe the vibe of that room as having good wa, as opposed to a room that feels tense and overwhelming and so on. So every space has this certain quality that influences the kinds of relationships that can form there. So what recognizes the way that these relationships are affected by the space that they're in. So the idea is basically harmonious spaces lead to harmonious social relationships and the other way around too. So it refers to form and space, but it's also kind of used as an aesthetic guide to create like visually peaceful and balanced looking spaces. But it's also more of as well an internal feeling, and people use it as a general approach to life as well. But in terms of visual harmony, generally we mean elements that you're putting together should work together. So they shouldn't visually seem to be fighting or competing with one another. On its highest level of harmony, we might say that we want the elements to kind of flow together to the point where they almost become one. So they're not immediately seen as kind of separate individual elements with no relations to one another, but they stand in this greater unity. So they contribute to a wider overall space. It also involves communal harmony, so designing with the greater good in mind. So in traditional Japanese homes, for example, they're designed not just with the person who's going to live there in mind, but their space is designed specifically for guests included there as well, which is something that we don't tend to do here. So the structure of the house is designed to link both of these private living spaces together with spaces specifically for hosting and for socialization and for strengthening relationships with other people. So this is things like traditional tea rooms in every home for the tea ceremony or tea ritual. And this reflects this harmony between the individual's self-identity and the self as part of wider society. So these two elements are physically reflected in the homes as well and connected. So as part of this approach of designing spaces that benefit wider society, Also, traditional wa spaces in Japanese architecture tend to involve the use of natural materials. So these kind of design choices are also important. This usually means things like wood that's often left natural and untreated as well, so very natural. Stone, bamboo, and it also involves sometimes design choices that preserve traditions, sometimes traditional building techniques or rituals like the tea room, spaces that are designed to preserve cultural practices that specifically build a sense of community and shared history, not just because they are traditional, but it's ones that they specifically want to preserve because of this sense of community that they build. So I just have some photo examples now. So the first picture here, this is a waiting bench outside a traditional tea room. So guests are traditionally provided with this kind of calm waiting area in a garden, usually like a Zen garden, whilst the ceremony is being prepared inside. So these are structures that are like basically just really thoughtful gestures. It's a whole structure built in someone's garden for the use of guests. And as you can see, the colors and materials kind of blend with the natural environment. There's nothing kind of competing, as I was mentioning earlier. And it's also built for function. So it's built for the function of people. There's obviously a bench there where people can sit and wait. But off to this side, you can't really see, but there's often a toilet and a washroom. So this is all designed to facilitate comfort before these social gatherings. So it's gestures of respect as well. And this is a picture of a Zen garden as well from another angle. I've included this because I actually ran a workshop last year with a really, really great philosopher called Graham Parks. Part of it is actually recorded and online on YouTube, so I've added that to the recommended resources that are going to be at the end of this presentation as well. So I also highly recommend you to read some of his work. It's all open access on his website because he's just a really lovely person and he doesn't believe in paywalls. So, but particularly here, I was reminded of his writing because when he talks about harmony in space here in the Japanese Zen garden in particular, he talks about when landscapers that when they're thinking about placing the elements there, they don't impose their own individual wants and thoughts about where things like this certain rock should be placed, for example. But what they do instead is they tune into the harmony of the space. And as Parks says, they would ask the rock where it wants to be. So where the rock would be most comfortable. So it's not just about consideration and thoughtfulness of other people, but it's also of inanimate objects, interestingly. So it's about these kind of elements of the natural environment as well. So thinking about, for example, where the tree wants to be placed that works best for its needs and not my own. Where the natural place we might want to put this wall is so that the space kind of looks visually balanced and is functional. So not imposing my personal thoughts and desires onto this space, but entering into this kind of harmonious mental space where I'm thinking of the wider world and not just my individual self. And this is the final picture I've included, this section. And this is an example of what's kind of starting to become a new architectural movement. So I thought it would be interesting to you. And it is referred to as Wa modern. So this is a blending of these two different design choices that maintains this sense of harmony, but also adapting to obviously a more modern architectural style. But the reason I included this is because there's, very importantly, we need to emphasize that there is this idea that there is also harmony in contrast. So like the yin yang that you traditionally see in Japanese culture and wider East Asian culture as well. So this doesn't mean if we're trying to make a space that's harmonious, it doesn't mean it has to be kind of monotone or only consisting of flowing shapes. That's not really necessarily what harmony means. So it's possible to blend these kind of different opposing elements together, that they might be really quite different from one another, but they still maintain harmony as long as we place them in a particular way. So it's just about kind of making sure that these elements work together and neither one looks out of place or fights for the spotlight, that kind of thing. Nothing is too big or too small or garish. And like I mentioned on the first picture slide, it's also about human structures that aren't too imposing on the natural environment. So we don't want to impose human wants and needs. onto elements of nature, basically. And this is the third kind of space we are going to be discussing. This is actually the one that I work on the most in my philosophy, and that is ma. So that is the space between. Sometimes it's also translated as negative space, but just to kind of alleviate any confusion about that, we're not talking about negative space as an absence that separates, but we're talking about it as a relationship. So this isn't a lack of something, but we want to say that it's the very essence of a relation. And I'm going to try and illustrate what I mean using this quote. And this involves examples that are used frequently in wider East Asian literature. So this is from the Tao Te Ching, which is actually a Chinese Taoist text, but influential on a lot of Japanese philosophy and wider culture. So they often use examples like the teapot, where the space in between the ceramic is what gives it its use and makes it a pot, so it gives it its identity. So I'll just read the quote out now, just in case it helps anyone. But 30 spokes meet in the hub, but the empty space between them is the essence of the wheel. Pots are formed from clay, but the empty space within it is the essence of the pot. Walls with windows and doors form the house, but the empty space within it is the essence of the home. Therefore, something substantial can be beneficial, whilst the emptiness of void is what can be utilized. So it's basically just this idea of the importance of a pause, so where emptiness is just as important as substance. And it's applicable to everything. You see it everywhere in nature and society and culture. It's applicable to art, poetry, movies, especially if anyone happens to have watched any Japanese movies like Studio Ghibli movies. There's always these deliberate, quiet scenes in between the storyline where nothing is happening. Those are deliberate uses of ma, but it's also in wider film, things like the pause before a jump scare in a horror movie. That's just as important as the substance, as the loud bang or whatever in the essence of that moment. So you can think of it as well in terms of music. So the little bits in between each note, the silences which give the piece its form. And that's a long quote. I'm not going to read that, but that source is also in the references at the end. I recommend you read that book as well. And of course, it's present in architecture too. So this is kind of where the reputation of Japanese minimalism comes from as well. Whereas we tend to generally fill up our spaces to the brim whenever there's a space we want to put something there. It looks like something belongs to be there. Whereas Japanese society values emptiness. So it sees the gaps that we often overlook or want to fill as just as essential to the essence of that space as the form. So this unoccupied space or pause, they believe allows elements to breathe and come into their own. So that doesn't necessarily mean that spaces have to be minimal or empty. That's kind of their approach. But the philosophy behind it is more just about the awareness of the physical intervals between objects, the environments that are created in these in-between spaces. So valuing emptiness as we do substance. Because in this empty space, it's not nothing, it's not nothingness, but it's almost as if there's an invisible force that forms the relationship between objects. And as we're going to talk about in the next section, also between people. So this emptiness is actually the essence that connects things, not divides them as we think of it as. So emptiness is not just a lack of form. So Western thought generally holds form as the pre-ontological framework for being. But Japanese thought comes from a completely different standpoint. So it sees that they're both equal. So both emptiness and form mutually require each other. Therefore, emptiness is as constitutive of identity as matter. So emptiness too is substance. Okay, and now it's etymology time again, because I like to talk about this. The kanji used for ma this time, as you can see in the top, is actually one of the few kanjis, again, that's still in use, that has a traceable pictographic origin. And this one actually combines two kanji, and that's the kanji for gate and the kanji for sun. You can still see the resemblance. This is the evolution of it from the picture form to Oracle bone script. The kanji for gate, so the one on the bottom, you can see how that's evolved. And then underneath it in the combined kanji, there is the kanji for sun. So the kanji as a whole represents the gap between the doors that allows sunlight to shine in. So I just like that. So several of the concepts that I use in my work that are also relevant to us today, they use this kanji for ma to denote that it has something to do with spatiality. So most interestingly, and this is probably the most important thing that I want to communicate to you today, according to Japanese notions of identity and being, human beings have this essentially spatial quality. So this can be seen in the written language that I've highlighted in red on the board. So what they're trying to say is that this social interconnectedness of persons that's so heavily ingrained in language and in turn in Japanese thought is based on spatiality. And I think this is interesting because it stands in this kind of stark contrast to the singular, individualistic, and patriarchal English terms that we use for things like human and mankind. Whereas here, this spatial notion of self that's really ingrained in everyday life through language uses this Japanese word ningen, so that stands for human being. And it's again comprised of these two kanji components. So the first one is nin, and that represents something like person. So it's kind of how you generally refer to people, like that person there. And then the second part is gen, which is the same kanji for ma. And again, that means space between. So more specifically, this is describing that human beings are constituted not only by this individual element, so the individual person, but by this space in between oneself and other people. So being human is considered not as being in isolation, but existing in relation to others. So this relationality of personhood, it's not necessarily a new concept in the West, especially Western philosophy, but this Japanese notion differs because these relations necessarily require space. So that's why I'm talking about it today. So persons, according to, this is daily Japanese life as well, not just academics, but persons are spatial as well as just relational beings. And then another word I have on the board there is aidagara, and that's the next key term I use in my project too. And that translates to betweenness. And this references the space between persons specifically. So we're not talking about objects here, we're just talking about the space between people. And what we're talking about is that there's this physical empty space between individuals in the world that simultaneously distinguishes and connects us. So in this emptiness, we form our personal identity through interactions with and social relationships built with others in the spaces that I've been talking about today. So there's this kind of dualist idea that there are people that are individualistic selves, but there's also this betweenness that is, in fact, the essence of being human. So the space between two people is this mutual place where we kind of coexist. So we're able to form the kinds of essential relationships with the world that define us. So therefore, the essence of being human is this space between us and other. In this space, we find ourselves. So this raises questions about things like the need to reevaluate our understanding of identity. And that's what my own research attempts to do. So again, if we're thinking about the kanji that depicts the door, if we ask ourselves what a door is, what exactly constitutes its identity and the character of being a door, we might be tempted to list things like its physical elements, its frame, hinges, and things that are its form. So we're again operating from this pre-ontological assumption of being as matter. But what the door necessarily includes is this empty space, so the space in between the matter. And this gap isn't a lack of door. We shouldn't think of it like that. It's not a space in between components of the door, but it is the door. So we can ask these same kind of questions about the identity of persons. So in terms of the constitutive elements of persons, are we just our material bodies, or are we better thought of as spatially extended, spatially embodied beings that also exist in empty places in between each other? So my presence on Earth isn't just experienced within the spatial limits of the boundaries of my skin, but it extends outwards into these kinds of spaces. So this is something that's such an essential part of me, my relationships to other people and to other things in the world. And they all exist in these intervals between us. So this is essentially the theory I work on, but it's based on the philosophy of Watsuji Tetsuro. So Watsuji argued that in emphasizing this spatiality of human beings, it's far more difficult to consider human beings as strictly an individual. So he's against individualism. Due to these essential intersections of human beings and of self and other across this common spatial field. So we never exist in isolation in the spatial field. So being human is to form interconnections with the climate in which we find ourselves. So we're talking about climate in terms of both social relations and also relations to environmental phenomena and our environment, our physical, geographical setting. And his landmark book, Fudo, which I've written on the board, it's called Climate and Culture in English. This refers to this idea that human beings are inescapably environed by our land and our climate. So this includes factors like weather and landscape, but also our social environment, community, society, and so on. So he tries to call attention to the way that all of these factors play a vital role in the development and identity of every single human being. So from the moment that we're born until the moment that we die, we are like environed, he says, by these factors. So these are all factors that alter both our physical bodies and our minds. So generally, we tend to say one or the other is constitutive of self, so either our mental faculties or our body, or sometimes both. But both of these things are so inescapably environed by these things that they're kind of inseparable then from our personal identity. So who we are isn't simply what we do as individuals in our aloneness, but it's this result of the climactic space into which we're born, live, love, and die, and so on. So this concept that he talks about, fudo, it encompasses more than just the natural and physical characteristics or features of space, but it's also all about this shared experience that we have with others in the space that we find ourselves in. So the space of our physical landscape, through all the ways that we've discussed today already, influences the kind of relationships that can form there and therefore influences who we are and our identity. So this is the final thing I'm going to talk about today. And this is the difference between what he calls lived space and physical space. So this is the concept that's discussed in his other book, Watsuji's other book, Rinrigaku, or Ethics. And what we're talking about is we're talking about humans as being spatial, but we don't mean that just that we exist in space or we're merely taking up space like all the other things in the world, like inanimate objects and so on. But we're talking about beings being spatial because we're embodied beings that experientially live space. So that's what he's talking about, this lived space. And he says it's not so much the essential quality of a physical body as it is the manner in which a subject operates. So we're not just talking about our physical bodies being in space, but we're talking about how we act and how we live in space. So since the manner in which a subject operates is always shaped by the practices and spaces that it shares with others, the lived space of betweenness is therefore an intersubjective space. So these shared spaces have distinctive affective hues that play a central role in determining how we connect with the people and things around us. So that's through all the kinds of space that we've mentioned today. So lived space therefore differs from physical space, but it's intrinsically tied to it. So it's always influenced by it. And that's basically the essence of what we've been discussing in all of these aspects of space today. So just to go a little bit more into how we can influence lived space through physical space before we finish, I'm just going to use this example of the confession booth. So this is like a traditional Catholic, or I don't know what other religions use it, but a confession booth. So as I said, this physical and lived space are intrinsically linked, but they don't always correlate in the usual sense. So for example, in terms of quantitative size. So what I mean is that bigger physical spaces don't always mean bigger lived spaces and so on. And that's the thing I want to talk to you about when thinking about designing architectural spaces. So the confession booth is deliberately crafted to manage spatial and affective dynamics of betweenness. So its design, which is normally a wooden booth with a central compartment covered by a door or a curtain. This shields the confessor from the gaze of others, so including the priest, who can only hear the confession spoken through a lattice dividing the compartments between the two. So its structure is designed to minimize things like embarrassment and distraction by occluding the outside world. So instead, the confessor is encouraged to feel this sense of intimacy, privacy, and trust within the space, and this feeling compels them to speak freely about their sins and seek forgiveness. So the physical structure and space of this artifact therefore shapes the attention and the effect of the priest and the confessor. So they both speak in quiet tones naturally as a result of the space that's been designed. So this confined space limits unnecessary movements and external distractions, but the structure also shapes the lived space of the booth. So its effective hue and distinct styles of interacting and intensities of betweenness that reflect this effective hue. So it animates a sense of openness, vulnerability, and trust that wouldn't be achievable if practice were to unfold in a much more exposed setting. So although the physical space of the confession booth is small, it can be nevertheless said to extend this individual sense of subjective spatiality by establishing a relational space that offers felt possibilities for intimacy, intensity, and shared connection that would be unavailable in other, perhaps physically larger spaces of betweenness. Okay, and these are the references. If you want this list sending to you or you can't access some of the papers, you can just contact one of the organizers or get them to forward it to me and I can send it to you. I also have a ton more resources that I could recommend if you're interested in a particular part. And then before I finish, instead of a Q&A, I was kind of thinking, you can ask me questions, that's obviously fine, but in keeping with this topic, I don't want it to be one-sided or individualistic and not a productive space or environment. So I'd rather open up the topic to more like a roundtable kind of discussion. So people can ask me questions or just share their thoughts. You can ask direct questions to me or more general to other people in the audience to encourage this communal participation. So I've added some ideas just to help prompt some things that we could talk about. That's it. Yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Ellie, for all of this. And honestly, I love what you did with the question ideas and prompts because I think that it is really amazing to roll the ball, kind of. Can I go and maybe share a few ideas that were popping through my mind?
Yes, absolutely, please.
Oh, wow. I was taking notes all the time. And on the first question that I have just read, that you say what kind of physical design elements might create a good wa and wa spaces. If I remember correctly, the wa is the harmony relation. Okay, perfect. I guess what you referenced it as vibes. I think that what you did now is a really nice wa technique.
Thank you.
Because it's a really nice way in order to get us all connect and have this kind of relationship. So yeah, I really also I wanted to stick to something again in the wa in the second part in the wa space, which I honestly you used a phrase that really stuck with me, and it was that are really thoughtful gestures and gestures of respect, which I think that this is what gives even architect actually thinks about the gestures, the space that and the opportunities that wants to be offered to someone that is going to use that space. I think this is what creates that maybe space, the opportunity to create relationships and the concept of offering something to someone else, which is a relationship by definition. So, and this is kind of what you did at the end. I mean, that was a really nice gesture and thoughtful gesture in order to include us and in order to share with us. And yeah, you offered us the opportunity, you know? So Yeah, I could go on and on. So if someone else wants to go, I will come back. I will be here, I promise.
I would also like to suggest if anyone has a question, maybe they can raise their hands.
Yeah, definitely.
And maybe if I can go next.
Of course.
Because there was a question at the end about how we could connect this to the context in Cyprus. I was thinking that some spaces, some regions within the walled city of Nicosia, they somehow have a certain vibe, and this vibe has been preserved through time, and everything that's torn down and rebuilt somehow reflects the same vibe. So it's like certain regions have certain hold certain memory, and that is being reflected in how they are redeveloped through time. And you did say something about artifacts in your abstract. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that maybe.
Okay. So artifacts, I'm just talking about things that are man-made, usually things that are just not conscious things, but so basically my thesis specifically is about our relationship to artifacts, because people tend to talk about our relationships to people, which is very important. They also talk now, it's kind of trendy to talk about relationships to environment, and this is all things that I include as well. But what's least talked about is relationships to artifacts, and that could include things like buildings, but it could include things that are, for example, sentimental to us, so like our belongings, possessions, and things like that. Because I think in the same way as environment, these things that we're surrounded by shape who we are and the relationships that we have with the wider world in exactly the same way often. So whereas people talk about environmental phenomena, they talk about like the weather and things like that as governing our communal identities as well. They don't tend to talk about the physical landscape in terms of things that have been built by people. And obviously in the Cypriot context, there's things like the physical divide that cuts these two communities apart. Obviously, that can be thought of as this kind of artifact. It's a non-living thing that's been man-made, manufactured, and that massively affects the relationship between the two communities. It's not just a soft border, and it's not just as in a wall like it is in a lot of different places, but there's this physical empty space dividing two communities. They don't have the closeness of one's on one side of a wall and one's on the other, but it's not just the artifact of there being a physical border, but it's the fact that this physical border also includes this empty space that in some of these contexts, empty spaces, obviously, as we've spoken about, allow relationships to emerge and develop. But this is an empty space that people can't use. This is an empty space that it's cutting off communities rather than allowing them to come together. So it's not a helpful kind of an empty space. And yeah, I think that's how we could apply the idea of artifacts and empty space to this Cypriot context. Some of the ideas I've been thinking about.
If I could, sorry, also say something, is that the way I see artifact is as a space in something in space that also preserves the memory of what it used to be. And it's like if you take the example of the the green, not the green line, the green line within the city, within the walled city,
Yeah.
which used to be a river, which used to divide people again, but in a more physical way. It has developed into a man-made border now. So that's what I was trying to say, that things somewhat preserve things in space preserve their identity, and they tend to hold the same meaning through time.
Yeah. Well, this is interesting because that is exactly what my actual thesis, my PhD thesis, is based on. So it's about the ways in which artifacts preserve human identities, and whether after like my physical body and my psychology have died, if I am still in some way preserved in memory through these physical artifacts that people associate with me. So that's actually what I exactly work on.
If I actually can add something, it's what you said really, and I think it's a nice idea to build on it. Generally, not now, but yeah. It's what you talked about before, referring to the door as a concept, which is a literal like build thing, or it's something really materialistic that divides two spaces or connects two spaces. So in terms of what we said now and what Marina said about the border and about what you said before, I think this is the difference, that it's not something that divides two spaces, but has the possibility and gives you the opportunity to pass through it or open it and get to the other side. It's something that it is built there in order to disconnect. And on what Marina said, because my research on university was basically the history of this line and the process of evolving all those identities that through time, and what it is left of it now, of what it used to be. We don't have the memory of that being a river. So, and I mean, this isn't the case for lots of generations, for hundreds of years. So it's really important to realize that something that was a physical line, a divider, or something in space that actually then it connected things. Now, as a line, as a physical geometry, it was preserved, but it has a really different identity now. But its geometry and its purpose of dividing two things to give them two different meanings or something like that, it's the thing that actually evolved and now has its own identity. So yeah, I think Asia wanted to say something before.
Yeah, no, I've been thinking about the second question. In your own life, what are some ways your identity has been influenced by space or climate? I think it's very obvious how the culture you grow up in and the culture you interact with, how that influences your identity. That's quite obvious.
Yeah.
But I really don't know how the space or the climate, it's difficult to try to figure that out. And when we've had conversations with Ivo and Florenza, and for those of you who don't know, they're friends of EASA Cyprus, let's say. They're anthropologists. They've been helping us evolve our framework for the event. And, I was asking Ivo as well, and he was telling me, there's not always black or white answers to these things. And I think I expect maybe my brain works more scientifically. I don't know, if you grow up in this environment, you end up being like this. But no, that's not the case. So
it's not like horoscopes.
Right? So I don't know how the space I live in influences my identity. It sure does, that's for sure. But I really cannot put my finger on it. I don't know. Can you maybe answer the question for yourself?
Well, there's two people jumping in, so I'll let you finish your thoughts first, and then I'll give you mine.
Marina, go on.
I was just thinking that at some point Eleftheria said, we don't have the memory of the green line being a river, but unconsciously we do. And on what Asia said, I feel like everything that's happening between us and the space is an unconscious process. So it's not easy to talk about things that are happening without you noticing them. So I feel like that's the reason we can't talk about it in words.
I think that this is something that I had since I was like from a child. I've always, what Asia just said, I honestly have really spatial memories since I was a child. And also I have really spatial dreams. I have seen the synthesis ideas for projects at the university when I sleep. So my brain works really in that particular direction. So, and today actually I was with a few friends having lunch, and I was telling them how I believe that my primary school has influenced the way I see things, and also how my kindergarten school, because I have memories from a really young age, which is, I don't know if it's usual, but and they have always been connected to space. And this is why I am able to remember them. Because if you actually, I always remember the position where I am standing, what I was wearing, and the viewpoint that I had. So I think that maybe for some people it's something that it is more natural, that to realize the I don't know if there's a word like that, the speciality that our bodies have, and the experience with the full sense of our bodies, the space. But the only thing that I can really just a simple example, our kindergarten school was a house, was an old house in the Agiomologites area in Nicosia, which had it had the plan, and you entered through the main entrance, and it had let me check my notes, the EMA space, which was a rectangle in the center of the room where you entered, and all the other rooms they had doors getting through that space. So it was the space that you had to enter in order to move to the other spaces, but it was the space that was connected also to the main entrance. So if you wanted to leave the house, obviously there was a back door in the outer kitchen and the backyard or whatever. However, I remember that this is where the different rooms were made into classes for different ages for the children. But when we had lunch, we had all together in that main in that mass space. So and when parents were coming to get their children or whatever, they were waiting just outside the entrance, which was like 3 steps above the ground. So I think that architecture used to have that sense. It doesn't have it so much these days, because we tend to, I agree with the last philosopher about the individualism and all this stuff. And we have the tension to focus on the more the functions and that part, which is more tangible. And we tend to forget that all the things that we have talked about are also tangible. I mean, what you said, that emptiness, it's a substance, I couldn't agree more. But I guess because we are not taught like that, it's really not that natural to see it and realize it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of that relates to various different stuff that we've talked about. So firstly, maybe part of the reason it's hard to kind of formulate like thoughts or talk about these kind of experiences is going back to the first one. Sorry, there's a lot of slides. Is going back to when we're talking about bar. These are kind of examples of things that we experience. So they're ways that we live space. We don't not just like positioned in space. It's ways that we're living in space. And this is a kind of knowledge that we might think of as being experiential knowledge. It's not knowledge that we can kind of communicate easily to other people if they've not been in our shoes, or sometimes even if we're trying to formulate it into words in our own mind, we can't really do that. But like you were saying, Asya, like you've got this kind of instinct that you have been shaped by it, but you just can't like express how. So probably that's like exactly the kind of thing that they're talking about when they're talking about using tacit knowledge as the foundation rather than knowledge of things that we can kind of express easily with others. And that's kind of the reason we need to be creating these kind of spaces where we can interact with people and have relationships with people where they can kind of feel the ways that we've been influenced by where we've come from, rather than us having to try and formulate that into words, because sometimes that just can't be done. It's more something you have to see and feel and experience for yourself. So yeah, that's kind of my 2 pence.
I don't know if you realize, like, you're not fully familiar of how we function in EASA, but all of this, I feel like, really strongly relates to how we function in this community. I was just in a meeting of the community called INCM, anyway. So we talk about what constitutes a good discussion space, both physically and, mentally, and how do we create safe space, stuff like that. And I feel like it's easier to describe these sensations and phenomenon when it comes to EASA rather than myself as a person and how it's influenced my own identity, because with EASA it's a shorter amount of time, it's more condensed, it's we only gather for 2 weeks at a certain space with a certain number of people, so it's easier to describe. And I feel like this theory really could easily be studied through this community platform that we have, and it's a good theme for a future event, actually.
I'm glad it was
Yeah,
a good
it's
experience.
amazing. It's amazing. It's really thought-provoking, and it gives, I feel like it's we talk about these things a lot, and it's giving context to what we're saying. I personally didn't have this knowledge before, so it's kind of how do I say this in English? It's translating my feelings it's into words, what I've been thinking.
I think
Really.
that's kind of the point. Like a lot of these concepts are just things that are used in like everyday life in Japan that we don't actually have any kind of equivalent or even close equivalent
Right.
for. So it's something that like that's kind of what I'm trying to say is if we use these kind of concepts that we don't have, hopefully it'll stop this individualism that's forming, because it seems that because we don't have words to kind of communicate a lot of these things, we don't have the foundations that they have, we don't have these frameworks, we come from a very like patriarchal individualistic framework that seems to be irrelevant until you start exploring these ideas and you realize just how ingrained it is and how it just leads to like a snowball effect where every aspect of our lives is focused on like self-centered individualism. Whereas so this is the other thing, I'm just going to talk about my thesis again for a second. So this is the other thing that I work on, is because we're told that the alternative to that, so the way that we have to stop individualism is to be selfless. But every time you tell people to do that and they're like, well, it's great in theory, but we always are going to have this instinct that it's a survival instinct where we need to look after ourselves and we have to do things that are good for us as well. We can't just live in this mind space where we're always going to act selfless. It's just not possible. But my theory that I'm trying to spread to you as well today is that if we just instead reevaluate what we mean by selves, if we start to realize how doing things for ourselves benefits everything else, and doing things for everything else benefits ourselves, if we start to think of selves in this kind of like spatially extended way, not just, as I said, limited by what's within the boundaries of our skin, but it extends into all of these kind of spaces, into our relationships with other people, and it can even be embodied by these artifacts, then we start to naturally prioritize the interests of those things as well, because we see how it benefits us. So that's kind of the point.
Do you think these relate to ideas of virtue? Because I know that's a big topic of discussion in like ancient Greek philosophy, and how a virtuous person, does the right thing and for themselves, and well, I don't know, I'm probably super simplifying these ideas, but and in turn, a virtuous person who does the right thing, does the best thing in the interest of society, which comes back to them. So it's this cycle. Do you think those
Exactly, yeah.
relate?
That's the line people say is like, well, there's no such thing as like a selfless good deed because you're doing it to fulfill something that's good for you. And this kind of position naturally avoids those kind of criticisms because we're not trying to draw such a distinction between the two. And this is one of the like ontological frameworks of Japanese thought, is that there isn't such this strict boundary between everything. We have it for some reason in most of Western thought, in society and in philosophy and in everything, that there's this kind of either or dialectic, like there's self and then there's other, and there's very little overlap between them as these ontological entities, and they don't have that distinction in Japan. That like to say that something is me and something is something else, there's so many problems with trying to define the boundaries of those two things, and if we just stop thinking of them in those dialectical ways, then we can start to understand the true nature of them as being more connected and more united. So there's no such thing as a selfless good deed, not because we don't care about other things, but because if we do things for other people, we're in that, like we're part of the environment. It's not like environment is separate from us. So to do things for the environment, to do things for society, is doing stuff for us because we are always in that. Like we can't ever separate ourselves from that. Even if we go off and live on a desert island, like we're always going to be connected to where we came from. We're always going to be speaking a language that has like a vast history. We're always going to have thoughts that have been influenced by societies that have come before us. And there's no way that you can be a human being and be detached from these things. So to draw such a line between the two just makes no sense. Yeah.
Marina, go on.
I just wanted to ask if you've experienced Japanese culture, maybe you've visited Japan. Have you actually seen a difference between because people in Japan, they have the words for it and we don't. Is there indeed a difference between the way they live their everyday life?
Yeah, so I'm going next year, hopefully. I've not been yet, but obviously all of my research is centered on this, and my supervisor is Japanese, and most of the academics I work with are Japanese. So I don't have the first-hand knowledge, but I know from my research and my experiences talking to them, unfortunately, their society is very, very westernized now. It's very, very individualistic, and that's due to them trying deliberately to adopt Western culture and the ideals that we've been imposing on the rest of the world through colonialism. So it's unfortunately kind of a stereotype that the Japanese people are so like in tune with nature and environment, and there are still elements where they have a lot of thought for other people. Like, as you'll know, some of the stereotypes are very true, like the streets are very clean, people are generally quiet in public so that they're mindful of other people minding their own business and things like that. But they are now just another modern individualistic capitalistic society that have lost a lot of these things that were so important to them once upon a time. And the reason why I keep saying they have such different frameworks for all of these thoughts is, if you know anything about the history of Japan, it was closed off for hundreds and hundreds of years from the entire rest of the world. So all of these philosophies kind of came into being with no influence from other countries, no influence from the West. And then there was this sudden moment when they were like, okay, we're going to open ourselves up to the rest of the world. And that's when things very, very quickly shifted. And all of the philosophers that I work on, they're like modern Japanese philosophers, but they're from the early 1900s, most of their work. They're all in this kind of like crisis space of where do we negotiate the philosophy of the Western world and trying to preserve our tradition. So that's why a lot of the people I work on are having this kind of like identity crisis, trying to avoid individualism, the things that are being proposed as like correct by the West. So just general notions of like rationality and things like that they say are like the only or proper ways to do research in science and philosophy and being in general. So the history actually is very complicated because all of these ideas were very, very strong for so long because there was no competition with things like the Western thought, and then all of a sudden there was, and they were being told like, we need to adopt this. Like, it was really being pushed on them that we should become now all of a sudden a Western society and just somehow adapt all of these notions of thought that are so alien to somehow fit our current society. And that resulted in a lot of very difficult things. Like, now we have this like massive overworking culture in Japan, things like that, where they've just kind of gone, well, I don't know how to adapt these Western ideals to our society. We don't know how to do it. We're just going to take it to an extreme. And then it results in things like there's a lot of suicides and a lot of like isolation and things like that, which is obviously not what we want. People just take themselves out of society because there's like so many of these ideals that just don't fit the natural progression of Japanese thought and culture, that is kind of like a huge disjunct now, and it's not reflective of all of these traditional concepts anymore, sadly.
I think just to add a few thoughts to that as well, is that this is something that I have discussed with a few friends and professors that we had at university, that when this is something that happened to the Greek culture as well, because Marina, when she spoke before, she said that we don't have the words to express these kinds of things. But I think that the Greek language has all the, it's a language. I think that as civilizations, I mean the Japanese civilization and the Greek civilization and the Chinese and etc. are civilizations that go a long way back. So I guess
Yes.
that if you see it in that historical like sense, and when you actually go back, you could find all the things that you talked about. So if we want to like recreate our relationship with the basics, maybe we could search in those cultures that have really deep roots in the yeah. And I was thinking when you were speaking something else, this is something that I get that triggers me sometimes, that when people speak about the Greek civilization and they connect it to the Western civilizations, they are the way that Greek culture is connected and to the Western culture, because we speak about how we say neoclassicismos, Marina? Help me.
Neoclassicism.
It's just like that. Okay. Yeah. I think because with a professor that really works in this area with connecting architecture with philosophy and spatial actually philosophy, is that, yeah, Western civilization had the Greek culture and the Greek civilization as the symbolic context in which it later built the civilization, but it's a projection. It's how you want to use that in order to give definitions or yeah. So I think that where we actually lose it many times is what you said about really trying to define things with really hard lines. And this is I think that's something that Japanese culture and the ancient Greek culture have in common, that when they were defining things, they used intersecting things that used to intersect other definitions in order to through a more relationship way of defining something. So I remember like Aristotle's definition of time, which is the move. We understand time through movement. So aging is the movement of our body through time and our cells and everything like that. So I think that it's really nice, and it's something that makes me really happy, honestly, that after all these years of trying to create a self, I mean, society really focused on building individuals and really focusing on someone as a person, as an individual. We are trying to connect again. So
Yes.
I honestly really enjoy that, referring to the past thing that is going on, and yeah, distracting and destroying or not acknowledging. I mean, if you want to defer yourself from your past, you're free to do it, and it is obviously it's acceptable and it's your choice. But if you choose to ignore it or just draw a line and leave it behind, it will keep following you, even if you don't understand it. So it's better. I think maybe it's harder. Obviously, it's harder to acknowledge it and live with it and decide on how you want to live with it. But just ignoring it, I don't think that worked really nice for us up until now.
Agree.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone else wants to maybe answer some of the questions that you have at the end, or maybe something else. Also, hi, Jakove. You can, if someone isn't comfortable like speaking, you can definitely write something in the chat and we will read it. So yeah, feel free to do that as well.
Yeah, I wanted to say something. Sorry, my name was a dot by accident. No, it was really interesting, the idea of the void and how important actually the void is to actually, it feels like from a first sight a neutral space to somehow recognize your own identity somehow, if I really understood. And I associate with recent theatrical performance that I've been last week, out of necessity. I don't know if the Greek Cyprus they have seen it, but it was very interesting, and it was like about the Cypriot constitution. It was challenging like what is written and why it's written, and I connect with what Eleftheria just said with what you choose and everything, because you are actually disconnected with such long history. And there was a phrase in the whole play that, I mean, I took a lot of notes, and it was telling that actually the buffer zone that we have in the island might be actually the more lively place, like the place with the more life might be in. And they referred to actually the nature, like because we have some species that they're well preserved in buffer zone because there's no almost no human presence. But I connect with the void, what you said, and the void between the two cultures, or I mean the two main populations on the island. That yeah, I don't know. It's clicked in my mind somehow. That's yeah, a bit some like a metaphor. Yeah, that's what I meant.
I mean, yeah, I
Yeah,
didn't think
that's
about that.
yeah.
Oh, sorry, Ellie. Go ahead.
No, you go. You
No, I
go.
was gonna think about the animals. Yeah, I mean, we only think of it as human-centric, you know, we can't enter it, but that's not to say the animals cannot, you know, and it's just a space for them. In fact, it's probably, you know, a positive space for them, whereas for us it might be have negative connotations. A friend of mine, when he was in the army, he used to have to travel through the buffer zone, and there are some points where it's like hundreds and hundreds of meters, and he was telling me there are like wild rabbits and I don't know, fox, whatever, in the center of Nicosia, which is insane. But yeah, that's a, I guess, positive way of thinking of it. If we want to, you know, say something positive about the buffer zone, is that, you know, it's kept some sort of, I guess, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of some green space in Nicosia, it's provided this breathing space. Yeah, maybe that's a nicer way of looking at it.
I think on what you just added, a friend of mine, when they did their thesis at the university, they were working on a space in the area of Corinthos in Greece here, where there was this huge archaeological site which is closed, like you cannot enter it. It is a working archaeological site. But because it's it used to be a port, an ancient port there, which is like, I mean, 2,000 years old, maybe, whatever. And it hasn't been working since lots of hundreds and thousands of years. Now it's actually a space where animals and a special kind of species live. So when they were trying to, you know, connect these layers of living spaces, like the archaeological side, a space where people could visit, could go, people do swim actually there now that it's not a port, obviously. And it was really amazing seeing that even if people do abandon a place for many reasons, that nature will still have and find its own way of recreating life there. So when we actually afterwards, I mean, as architects, will maybe, if we want, reestablish something there, we have to keep in mind that all those years that it was deserted from us, it has been inhabited from someone else, from something else. So now we have to respect also their way of living, and all those years that have passed are part of what we need to include and incorporate in whatever we might want. Because we tend to, especially in the archaeological kind of area of architecture, we tend to monumentize and all this kind of stuff, which were actually the houses and the public buildings and the public routes of people just like us, but it was like 2,000 years ago. So it's really amazing how things tend to get holy when they are common things, and we do not live our life in our daily life in a holy way and respect on our common routines and everything like that. So it's really weird if you think of it that way. I don't know if someone wants to say something else. Actually, it's been really nice.
I'm
Maybe
glad everyone enjoyed it.
if there's a question from someone from our international friends.
Please do.
We had Milica and Basha, but they texted me they had to leave. So,
Okay.
if anybody else has questions.
I was thinking that because Ellie, when you started talking, you said that you hope that actually this presentation might give ideas for people for workshops for the actual
Yeah.
event for SESAM. So
Exactly.
I think that before we close, because I don't think that we have any more questions or thoughts on that, maybe because we have recorded the lecture, it would be really nice to maybe have you a few minutes to talk about if you have any thoughts, if you want to give someone any direction on, doing that tangible, that translation of the tangible to the
Yeah.
substancy thing. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, so basically, these are all ideas that you can plagiarize if you want to and help set up a workshop in the actual thing in March. Because I deliberately didn't talk that much about the specific design elements that create these kind of environments that we've spoken about today, because that's something I want people to kind of explore on their own as well. That's why I have some of these questions, like what are the physical design elements that might create good bar and WA spaces? So I want these ideas to kind of be applicable to a more creative and architectural kind of workshop. I think that it would be really good to have someone with more of an architectural foundation adapt these into a workshop where you might be creating some of these kind of spaces as part of the actual week in March. So if anyone watching this live or in the recording does want to use some of these to inspire a workshop of your own of that nature, that's absolutely fine. If you want me to have input and advise you on the kind of philosophical background, please just get in touch. But yeah, these are all ideas I want people to use in their own work and their research, so no gatekeeping.
Perfect. Yeah. So I guess that this is goodbye for now, maybe. And yeah, Marina, we have this one recording, right?
We do.
Yeah, perfect.
Thanks for your time, Ellie. Really, we
Yeah.
appreciate it. This was
No,
very
thank you. Thanks to everyone who attended and organized and listened to all of my thoughts. I really appreciate your discussion as well at the end. It was very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, really, really thank you. And I guess we'll see everyone. And Ellie, if you want to join us in the other lectures as well,
Yeah, I'd love to.
feel free to do it. So thank you once again. And guys, we'll see you, I guess, next time.
Sunday.
Yeah, next Sunday, actually, yeah.